We might kick off. A big welcome to everybody. Really nice to see you all on the call, and I'm sure there'll be a few others joining us in the coming minutes. But great to see you all, and welcome to our March session. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands on which we're meeting today. We're on Gadigal land, and recognise and acknowledge the traditional owners across the country, and also recognise their ongoing connection to lands and waters, and also pay our respects to their elders past and present. Tonight we're going to hear from two fantastic speakers. Firstly, Professor Brendan Wintle, who's the Director of the Melbourne Biodiversity Institute. Welcome, Brendan. We're really excited to have you on the call. And then from Thea Ormerod, who is the Chair of the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change. And we're also delighted to have you on the call, and we're really looking forward to hearing your contribution as well, Thea. So I suppose before we start, just confirming the format for the evening. First of all, we're going to hear from Brendan, who's going to talk on the broad topic of biodiversity. Then we'll have a chance for some Q&A. And so if you would like, you're very welcome to put questions in the chat, or also there's an opportunity to ask questions. And then after that, we're going to hear from Thea, and we'll have a chance to ask Thea some questions as well. So.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Just to introduce Professor Brendan Wintle. Brendan is the Director of the Melbourne Biodiversity Institute at the University of Melbourne. He's a global leader in conservation ecology. He specialises in modelling and analysis to support decision-making and policy in conservation. So he's an absolute leader in the biodiversity field. Brendan was previously the Director of the Commonwealth Government-funded Threatened Species Recovery Hub, amongst many other responsibilities and achievements in the biodiversity field. In his spare time, Brendan can be found searching for spider orchids, greater gliders, and bogong moths. And also, I sent around just now a very recent article that Brendan wrote for Australian Geographic that some of you might have read as well. So very warm welcome, Brendan, and over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Caroline. And thanks, everyone, for joining and for having me here tonight. It's always great to make new friends. So very excited to be coming to you from Wurundjeri country here in Melbourne. I'd like to pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders past, present and emerging. So I'll just start a little bit about me. Stephen suggested it'd be a good idea just to a little bit mention my background. So I grew up in central Victoria in the country. I worked the vineyards around Heathcote as a teenager, and then used to travel a lot up to the country in northeast Victoria to Mitamita, where my grandparents were, and spent a lot of time up in the mountains. So between the sort of box ironbark forests and snakes and scorpions of Heathcote and the vineyards, and then the beautiful mountains and in northeast Victoria up at Mitamita, I gained a pretty strong affinity, I guess, with nature and biodiversity. I trained at Melbourne University as a forester, spent a couple of years in forest policy in Queensland, where I helped try and introduce unsuccessfully, a regional forest agreement in southeast Queensland. There was a political solution brokered instead, which probably wasn't as good for the forests, but that's life in public policy. I didn't last too long in the public service in Queensland. I went back to Melbourne, did a PhD in mathematical ecology with a guy called Mark Bergman, Melbourne University. And then from then, I guess I've worked variously in universities and postdoctoral positions, and then teaching positions around the world. It's been a fabulous area to work in, great people. So I've been very lucky in that regard. I was, as Stephen mentioned, the Director of Australia's Threatened Species Recovery Hub from 2016 to 2022. That ended up, and that was a really fascinating role. We were a sort of a $60 million centre across the country, basically there to support any body, any organisation that was involved in threatened species recovery, providing the sort of knowledge, support, guidance and technical support for people doing threatened species recovery. And then, yeah, I guess in the end, it was a tricky relationship with the government at the time. I guess we had a couple of issues where we sort of, I guess, spoke publicly about the state of biodiversity and nature, a little bit along the lines of what I'll mention tonight, and that ended up not going so well with us, with the government of the time, and that was the end of the Threatened Species Hub in 2021. We sort of had residual work through to the end of 2022, but basically went out just before the end of the Morrison government. And so that's biodiversity can be a tricky political space. And so we've sort of navigated that over the years through various hubs. I then established a thing called the Biodiversity Council, which, for those of you who might know of the Climate Council, which is a sort of an expert-based advocacy organisation for bringing sort of, I guess, solutions and public awareness around climate change. We're trying to do the same thing for biodiversity with the Biodiversity Council. It's an expert-based organisation that has 40 of Australia's sort of leading biodiversity academics, experts, and some people from the NGO sector on the council, and you'll see a lot of the work that I'll talk about this evening is sort of coming out of Biodiversity Council work. We're basically trying to help create greater national awareness of the biodiversity crisis, why biodiversity is so important to us, why losing biodiversity is a problem for everybody, and what we can do about it, both in terms of the individual empowerment motivation, but also in terms of guiding public policy. So some of my message, I guess, and certainly the message in the Australian Geographic link that Stephen mentioned, was around trying to create that awareness and motivate change in the biodiversity space. So I'll share my screen and start talking a little bit more about biodiversity. If at any point you feel that I'm using jargon or words that you're not quite understanding, please do just put your hand up. I'm very happy to sort of make this I guess, a conversation all the way through. So if you have something that you don't quite get, or you're particularly interested by anything, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. I'm very happy to stop and start a little bit. So hopefully you can see my screen. It's projecting okay. I'm just going to put you guys over to the side a bit so I can run it. So, okay, biodiversity crisis, and what can we do about it? I've already acknowledged where I live and work. Biodiversity, we often use this term expecting that everybody's going to know what we're talking about, but of course it's not always the case that everyone knows what biodiversity is. It's just a word we use to describe the diversity or variety of all life on Earth at all levels, from species to genes to ecosystems. And this little graphic, I guess, just sort of highlights that at each of those levels, from genes up through species to ecosystems, there's different ecosystem services, or different services that are provided by biodiversity. And so just to tease that out a little bit, biodiversity and nature, and I'll use those terms a little bit interchangeably. Nature is a broader term that encompasses sort of all aspects of the natural world, including, climate and weather and all of those interactions, whereas biodiversity is specifically referring to the diversity of life. And so biodiversity underpins all aspects of life, our health, our well-being, and our prosperity. So you can see, I've got a couple of high-level points here. So in terms of health, of course, 70% of all medicines are either natural or copies of natural compounds, and biodiversity really has a critical role to play in supporting many aspects of our health, and medicines and the opportunity to create medicines out of natural products is just one aspect of that. In terms of well-being, we often talk about the relationship between people and nature being so crucial for people's intellectual development. We've seen studies that indicate clearly that children that get to grow up and go to school in places with high biodiversity, so lots of nature around them, have higher rates of cognitive development and lower rates of mental health issues. And so there's very clear links, I guess, and it's not not totally counterintuitive, but there's this very strong link between biodiversity and well-being. The World Economic Forum recently released a report that showed that around half of all global GDP is directly dependent on nature and biodiversity. That is, the products that are being produced, the food, the fiber materials, the construction materials, all rely directly on that functioning ecosystem and the biodiversity that underpins that. Of course, it's a funny kind of statistic, because if we lost a lot of biodiversity, and the cascades and the collapses we would probably see the loss of more than half of global GDP, but hopefully we never get to test that hypothesis. Food is critically dependent on biodiversity. So 75% of all crops are animal pollinated, and that represents around 35% of food production. That's just direct food production globally. Of course, we need animals and plants to make crops and pastures available, even when we're talking about meat and those sorts of things. So in fact, the sort of secondary support that biodiversity provides to ecosystems probably represents a lot more than 35% of food production, but 35% is directly reliant on animal pollinators. And of course, climate regulation. So the biosphere still remains the only viable carbon sink. We absolutely rely on biodiversity on land and in the sea to actually sequester carbon out of the atmosphere and into the carbon cycle. We're currently emitting around 12 gigatons of carbon per year globally, and the biosphere is able to sequester and secure around half of that, around 6 gigatons of carbon per year. So not only do we have to reduce our carbon emissions dramatically, but we also have to fortify nature's ability to sequester carbon and stop degrading nature so that it loses that ability to sequester carbon. And some very complicated cycles there that we need to look after. And nature is at the basis of that. And just to put that in perspective, the best engineering solution that we could possibly come up with, even if we could roll it out at scale now, could only sequester and secure 0.0001. No, 0.000, it's 10 to the negative 6% of the carbon that is sequestered by the biosphere. So in a sense, we just have no chance of turning the dial on greenhouse gas in the atmosphere if we don't have nature there to act as the carbon sink. So a lot of this, I guess, documentation of the criticality of nature in underpinning our life, our well-being, is nicely and I think succinctly reported in this Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services report. It's the 2019 Global Assessment, and it's a really nice, even if you just read the summary for policymakers, and I can perhaps give Stephen the web links a bit later, but it's a really good summary, I think, of our absolute reliance on nature, and then what's happening with nature, the state of nature. And I'll just report on a couple of those things here. So at the moment, we have, I guess, what we call a biodiversity crisis. Here in Australia, we have 1,400 plants and over 500 animals that are nationally listed as at risk of extinction. And already, since Europeans arrived in Australia, 1 in 10 mammal species have become extinct. So we've already lost 10% of the mammal fauna that were here when Europeans first arrived in Australia. Even just since 1985, we're seeing populations of threatened birds decline by 50%, and populations of threatened plants decline by 75%. So that's data from long-term monitoring that shows just the actual abundance of these species on average have declined dramatically. I might come back to that statistic in a minute. We've seen mass coral bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef. We've seen dramatic declines in shellfish and giant kelp forests in the southern oceans. And a report by both the CSIRO and the Australian Antarctic Division recently, with a number of authors from the Biodiversity Council, showed that 19 ecosystems around Australia are showing clear signs of collapse. And that's collapse in that sense is an absolute change in the nature of the ecosystem, so that can no longer support the services that it provides to all of us. And so an example of that would be here in Victoria, we have these forests called alpine ash forests, and the alpine ash forests have diminished in across Victoria because of the very high frequency of fire that we've been having. So these alpine ash trees take 20 years to reach sexual maturity before they can set seed. In about 85% of the range of alpine ash, we've had 3 cycles of fire inside 20 years. So the species is being burnt, killed, and then unable to actually regenerate from a seed bank because the trees that were there weren't mature enough to set seed. Just going to check this message in the chat to see if that's something. How much has nature's ability to sequester carbon deteriorated since industrialization? I'm going to come back to that one, Henrik. That's a good question. Thank you. Dramatically, I suggest, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you a statistic. I'll come back to that later. So I often get asked, are we really in an extinction crisis? What does that mean? And so this graph from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, I think, is quite a good representation of that. So this is talking about biodiversity globally, and what the graph shows is since 1500, what proportion of these taxonomic groups, the amphibians, the mammals, the birds, have become extinct over that time. And so it shows the accumulation of extinction across time since the 1500s. And so you can see for mammals, since the 1500s, we've had a fairly consistent loss of mammal species to the point where globally we've lost about 2% of mammals that existed at 1500. Whereas with amphibians, we didn't lose many, or we didn't have recorded amphibian extinctions until around the 1800s. And then with the introduction of a thing called chytrid fungus, and then also the systematic loss of wetlands, we've seen a dramatic loss of amphibians to the point where actually now that statistic, I think, is above 2.5% of the amphibians that existed in 1500 now no longer exist. They've gone extinct. And just to put that in perspective, this little grey wedge down here shows you the sum proportion of all of these taxonomic groups that we would have expected to have gone extinct over that time based on the background extinction rate from the fossil record. So species naturally over geological timescales go extinct because they either evolve into other things, they get outcompeted. Sometimes you get catastrophic events like meteorites or inundation of atolls. Species go extinct at a rate. But you can see here that the current rate is about 100 to 1,000 times the background extinction rate. So that's why people are calling this current period the Anthropocene extinction event. And extinction is the endpoint of a process of decline in species. So this is an index that we've developed called the Australian Threatened Species Index that we developed during the time that we ran the National Threatened Species Hub. And that sets a baseline at 1985. Then it sets that baseline at 1. And then it says, what's the proportional loss on average across all of these different threatened species? In this case, that's for birds, so it's a couple of hundred species. What's the proportional loss in the average population size for all of those species? So on average, since between 1985 and 2015, we lost about 50% of the abundance of these bird species. And so the process of extinction is just a gradual decline in abundance. So this is indicating that a bunch of species that, while they're not extinct yet, actually their population sizes are declining, and on average to around 50% of where they were at in 1985. So this Threatened Species Index is now part of our national wellbeing reporting. That's reported by the government every year. And I've got Madonna and George Michael here just to remind us how, recent 1985 was. That's not long ago. I was dancing to Madonna and George Michael. So you can sort of think about how that's such a short period of time. It's just a really small proportion of a lot of our lives, and yet we've seen, on average, a halving of the population sizes of all these bird species. And this is sort of indicative, I guess, of what's happening with biodiversity generally across the planet. And I've put this Christmas beetle up here just to prompt us, I guess, to think about other species that we've observed a dramatic change in biodiversity over just our lifetimes. And every time I give talks like this at landcare groups and other organisations across the country, people often come to me and say, yeah, we used to have, heaps of bandicoots here, but then suddenly, we don't have them here anymore. And that's, because we introduced cats and foxes, and people actually started poisoning them because they didn't like them digging up their lawns and tragic things like that. So yes, we're seeing a lessening of things, and that's that's an issue. We don't have invertebrates on here. Invertebrates are very poorly monitored, Amanda, and that's one of the main reasons why they're not there. We are starting to try and monitor invertebrates, but actually it's harder to do and it's less common to do, unfortunately. We do have information past 2015, Phil. We just haven't got that on the current slide of the index, but you can actually log on to the Threatened Species Index website, and you can look at the most recent data for all of these different taxonomic groups, if you like. And if you can't find Threatened Species Index website, I can give it to you again at the end of the night. And so what's driving this decline in biodiversity? Why is this happening? So there's some key drivers, and the drivers here in Australia tend to be pretty similar to the drivers globally, but with a couple of I guess, nuances or specific things here in Australia. So the key thing that really drives biodiversity loss globally is habitat loss. So the loss of the places and resources that animals need in order to survive. That's what habitat is, and we've seen a dramatic decline. Sort of, I guess, some examples. So since the year 2000, when the threatened species regulations were brought in, we've cleared an area the size of Tasmania of actual threatened species habitat. So this is not just vegetation, but it's actually mapped habitat for threatened and endangered species. We've lost 8 million hectares just since year 2000. Here in Victoria, since we've lost 95% on private land, 95% of the vegetation that was here when Europeans arrived is no longer here. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. Obviously, large areas of early clearing for establishment of agriculture, or European style agriculture. But we still see high rates of clearing, and we saw in Queensland just the year before last 680,000 hectares of vegetation cleared. It's as high as it's sort of ever been. So it's not something that just used to happen, it's still happening, and that has dramatic impacts on species because of the loss of habitat. It also has dramatic impacts on our carbon emissions and our ability, the ability of our ecosystems to sequester carbon. The other disturbing trend, I guess, is that we're seeing an increase in the frequency of really high intensity or catastrophic fires. This is a photo I took on Kangaroo Island just after the 2019 Black Summer fires. We were there helping people on the island to try and develop a plan for recovering some of the habitats of some critically endangered species there that had been almost completely lost. And the thing about this sort of new fire regime is that when you look at it from an air photo, or you look at it as a bit of a landscape shot like this, there's no green bits left. So usually a lot of the thing that we really noticed about the bushfires in Gippsland and was that when you look from above, usually even with really big wildfires, still there's gullies left where the fires jumped over it, and there's that residual green in the landscape that sort of indicates that some things were missed by the fire, and that there are really critical places for animals and plants to radiate back out from and help regenerate populations in the burnt area. Unfortunately, the intensity of fires just seems to be increasing so that you get less of that residual environment left after a fire, and that has big implications for species extinction rates. There are other drivers here in Australia, of course, of threatened species loss. We have a particularly bad track record of introducing animals and plants that cause a lot of damage. You know, here's just a couple here, like cats, you know, blackberries, other things, rabbits. This is a myrtle rust, which is a disease that's looking like it might sweep through a lot of the eucalypts in Australia. It's already spreading very fast. These introduced species have had a particularly big impact on extinction rates in Australia. And there are other things as well. As we see warming, we're seeing catastrophic heat events that can knock out whole populations of, for example, these spectacled flying foxes. It just gets too hot for them. They can't handle it. They drop out of the trees and die. And the warming, the lowering of rainfall and in the inside of the divide, and the nutrients that we're putting into the river systems is creating algal blooms that cause mass fish kills, and that's obviously having a big impact on a lot of threatened species as well. So there's a lot of issues, I guess, that sort of combine. There's some main ones: habitat loss, invasive species, but we're seeing other drivers as well now start to emerge to compound those issues and start to push more species towards the brink of extinction. So I've got a question for you. Of all of the species that we've introduced into Australia, I'll even just narrow it down to animal species, not including humans. Of all of the Europeans, I should say, of all of the animal species that we've introduced into Australia, which one do you think has had the biggest impact on threatened species across the country? So which one has driven the most threatened species to the brink of extinction? Got any guesses? You can pipe up if you like, or pop them in the chat. Cats, foxes, cats. Good,
Rabbits.
Good guess. Who said rabbits?
I did.
Oh, well done, Stephen. So rats, also a good guess. Cane toads, yes, definitely implicated in some extinctions. These are all devastating forces in the environment. But yes, the thing about rabbits is that a lot of our most threatened and endangered species are plants and rare plants. And rare plants can't germinate when you get immense outbreaks of, you know, rabbit population that just totally clears the vegetation in the area. So under rabbit grazing pressure, and rabbits are pretty much everywhere across Australia. It have been at higher densities in the past than now, but they are a #1 driver of threat because so many of our endangered species are actually plants, and so they're badly impacted. Other species that have a similar impact but aren't just quite as widespread yet are species like deer, goats, camels. Also, all those big herbivores across the country also add a lot of pressure to threatened species. Thanks for your guesses. All right, the other thing that's sort of emerging now, I guess, is climate change. I don't know, hands up, how many of you have seen this graphic before about the way climate's changed since 1880? So this, as you can see here, this graphic just shows all of the countries of the world that have long-term 100-year climate records. A large red dot indicates a hotter year in that place. A large blue dot indicates an anomaly from the long-term climate trend that makes it a slightly cooler year. And so what this graphic does is just show how we've had since 1880 in the long-term climate records, average hotter in the big red dots and cooler in the big blue dots. And you can kind of see it sort of mixes around between hotter and cooler years across the planet, depending on where you are, until you start to get into the 90s. And then you start to just see more and more above average years to the point where you get into the sort of, you know, the teens in 2000s, and the anomalies just are always positive, and they're getting bigger and bigger, these anomalies. So, you know, in 2018, 2019, we're then sequentially hotter and hotter years again after this graphic. So climate change is emerging now as a really significant driver of biodiversity change, and that's a pretty big challenge for us. There's some new challenges emerging. So as we know, we absolutely must transition towards renewable energy technologies, because if we don't, we're going to keep creating bigger and bigger climate problems for ourselves. But there's some challenges there too. You can see this is the Net Zero Australia report. It was done by some colleagues of mine at Melbourne Uni with collaborators around the world. And basically what they're trying to do is map the energy infrastructure required for us to meet net zero at 2050 through renewable energy technologies. And this is sort of some first pass mapping of what the energy infrastructure impacts might look like in terms of the footprint of where we would have to have solar arrays, wind farms, increases in transmission lines, large hydrogen, pumped hydro, all of those kinds of activities create impacts in the landscape. And that's a big challenge, both in terms of biodiversity, food, and other things. Now, we do have to do this, but this is just to indicate that there's some tough terrain for us to navigate over the next 10 years in how we create this energy transition so that it doesn't actually exacerbate extinctions and cause more species and more places to go extinct. So there's a tricky conversation that we're having to have now, and hoping that it doesn't get out of hand in terms of, I guess, other lobbies that would like to use that as a wedge for us. It's a bit tricky. But and this is just a graphic to indicate that the World Economic Forum, every year, the World Economic Forum does a economic risk register. It's a survey of the top economists around the planet. And you can see that in 2023, I think this graphic was from, might be 2022, they ranked climate action failure, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss as the top 3 threats to the global economy. And you can see that they come above, according to the economists, for about medium-term impacts on the economy, above things like livelihood crisis, infectious diseases, war, other things. So there's so that's I guess, just to sort of sharpen the message that this is not just a story by environmental people. This is a story by the World Economic Forum, who are now recognizing the absolute intrinsic nature of our reliance on nature and biodiversity. So sort of in summary, I guess, there are a few problems at the moment, and we have some control over what the outcomes. One of the biggest challenges that I think we have, and you can sort of see that in the statistics around habitat loss and ongoing clearing of habitats, is that we've lacked so far clear, strong enforced rules about habitat destruction and degradation. So that's something we're going through a process at the moment with what's called the environmental law reforms process, to try and improve, I guess, the transparency and rigor of our environmental laws. And the other thing is we've lacked the resourcing for species recovery and essentially the enforcement of our environmental laws. So in a way, the laws about habitat loss read okay at the moment, but they're just not currently enforced very well. So we sort of need those kind of triggers to make sure that the enforcement happens and the resourcing behind the recovery of species. So there's some fairly big challenges ahead of us to try and solve those couple of first order problems that we have that are sort of driving biodiversity loss. But there's a lot we can do. So I want to try and just talk about, I guess, some of the positive opportunities. So the Biodiversity Council recently released 10 things that we think we should urgently do in order to deliver on the government's Nature Positive Plan. So the Australian government released the Nature Positive Plan that set out aspirations for no new species extinctions by 2030, and higher conservation targets, and the development of an independent EPA. So I guess the Biodiversity Council has started to try and tease that out a bit and say, well, if you're going to meet these promises around no new extinctions, then we're going to have to start doing certain things and get cracking. So we would like to see them aligning the promises of the new legislation with global goals and global definitions for what nature positive means. We want to see that an EPA that's truly independent, legally binding environmental standards, an Indigenous Land and Sea Commissioner, and a reduction of the emphasis on the use of offsets. Come back and talk to you about offsets in a minute. It's a bit of an issue for us, I guess, that people have been abusing offsets over a long time, the last 20 years. So we need to sort that out, and we need to also identify critical habitats that really we can't afford to lose and make sure that they're properly secured. How can we discuss this reduction in biodiversity in a way that resonates with the general public? Very good question. In terms of direct impacts on us and our offspring. Thanks, Luke. I'd like to come back to that conversation at the end. Actually, I think that's a really critical conversation and certainly very much the point of the development of the Biodiversity Council. One of the things that I think we probably can address pretty quickly is the lack of resourcing that we put towards biodiversity conservation. So we know that the very clear signal that we get from the United States, where they actually have similar endangered species laws to us, except they're different in the one critical regard. When a species gets listed as endangered under the US Endangered Species Act, it's the expenditure that the government will make on the recovery of species is mandated under law. We don't have that same rule here. So they, on average, spend around $2 to $2.5 billion a year on conserving their endangered species, and we don't. And that's one of the big problems. So we've actually costed out, given all of the species that we've got on our list and what we think we need to do to actually avoid those species going extinct. We've costed out that we need to put about $2 billion a year into targeted threatened species recovery, which $2 billion sounds like a large number. I certainly don't have $2 billion. But of course, when you think that last year we spent $35 billion as a nation just on caring for our cats and our dogs, that even just the GST from the amount of money we spend on our pets would more than cover the resourcing we need to conserve our threatened species. We spent, I think we spent, $1.1 billion on pet grooming. It's just astonishing to me, but we do. And so as a nation, I guess the point is, I think we can actually afford to allocate the resources required to conserve these species. And then, of course, there's other things like fuel tax subsidies to mining companies and the like that cost us, $1 to $2 billion a year. So I think that's something that we can address pretty easily. A key opportunity that's arising, I guess, is transformation in business. So the most recent Global Biodiversity COP that we had, the Conference of Parties, it was very heartening, the presence of big business. That's the first time that that's ever happened at one of these global biodiversity meetings. We had the top 400 or so companies across the planet, the biggest companies across the planet, signing on to pledges around disclosing the impacts on biodiversity and creating a method for transforming to reduce impacts, much in the way that we've seen big companies try and do around climate change. This is a nice bit of work from McKinsey where they looked at the top Fortune 500, global companies and their targets for climate change, and 83% of the Fortune 500 companies actually have clear acknowledgement of the impacts of climate change on their business and have set targets for their own emissions and reducing their emissions, addressing climate change impacts. 15% of them have got acknowledgement of the impacts, but don't yet have targets. Conversely, for biodiversity or nature loss, only 5% of those Fortune 500 companies have actually properly acknowledged in their financial reports and set targets for around biodiversity loss or their impact on nature. Some have acknowledged but not set targets, and about half have not done anything. So you can sort of see that there's a big difference in the consciousness around biodiversity versus climate change in the business world, and that's something that I think is a huge opportunity for us to turn that around and actually create a lot more awareness and energy around that. I'll come back to the too hard box. I don't think so, but I'll come back to that question at the end. I think that's a good question. I'll save that one for later. one of the things that happened at our last global biodiversity conservation meeting of governments was that the government signed on to this thing called the Global Biodiversity Framework, which basically commits governments to conserving certain amounts of area for biodiversity and conservation reserves, and importantly, sets out mandatory reporting processes for large businesses. So the top businesses will be sort of under this commitment compelled by national governments to report on their biodiversity impacts, but also on how dependent on biodiversity they are and how fragile to biodiversity loss their businesses might be. So this is a really good initiative, I guess, and there's a process that's been set up to help businesses find their way through this disclosure process and then actually report against standards. So I see that as a good opportunity. There are some risks, particularly to do with greenwashing, I guess, and poor reporting, but I think there's some great opportunities there, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So a key initiative that's there set up to try and help big businesses report on their nature dependence, but also the impacts that they're having on nature, is this task force on nature-related financial disclosures. There's an analogy for climate disclosures that a lot of big organizations are now reporting on, and we're starting to see some of the bigger sort of leading edge businesses start to transform and do that for nature. There's a framework out there. You can, if you haven't already, some of you are probably already doing this, but you can look it up and start. There's a framework there set up to help people find their way through how to do financial risk disclosures around nature. And it's a pretty basic framework. I won't go through it right now, but the 4 key steps are: locate your interface with nature. How is your business interfacing with nature, both in terms of impacts and dependencies? Evaluate those impacts and dependencies, assess how big a risk they are, and then think about what the opportunities are for you to reduce those risks, whether they're direct risks you might be facing, like impacts on your supply chain, or whether they might be risks that you are facing in terms of reputation or regulatory risk, and then prepare to respond and report. So the LEAP process, it's pretty straightforward. There's some measurement issues, and I think a lot of these businesses are going to need a lot of help over the next 5 years to start getting their reporting aligned and having robust measures. It's a bit harder than just measuring greenhouse gas emissions, unfortunately. Nature's pretty complex and it's pretty place-based. There's been some high-level, what we call materiality assessments done already. This is a global assessment that was done by the World Economic Forum that just sort of gives you a very high-level understanding of where the biggest threats are coming to nature or to biodiversity, and mostly that's coming through through food, land, and ocean use. A lot of that is around food production. But then there's also infrastructure and built environment and energy and extractives. And this is just giving the proportion of the globe's threatened species that those different sectors are actually having impact on. So I won't go into that in more detail now unless other people are interested later. We're seeing EU laws start to evolve that are looking like they're going to make big changes, because they're actually potentially banning the sale of products in Europe that have land clearing and nature loss in their supply chain. That's potentially a big deal, and obviously that's reverberating through farming communities and large farming companies here in Australia. I think there are some huge opportunities to do things better in the urban design and infrastructure space. There's some fantastic new programs going on around biodiversity sensitive urban design, and Georgie Garrard and Sarah Beckers here at RMIT, I think are some really good leaders in that space. If you're interested in urban development, then I can certainly put you on to talk with those people about those good opportunities. Obviously, agriculture takes place across 60% of our land area, so anything we can do that's good in agriculture, that's good for biodiversity, is a huge win. This is just a cute little example of where rice growers are starting to, just with simple changes to the timing of their planting and harvesting, they're able to actually provide really good habitat for this critically endangered Australasian bittern. So, you know, and then they're marketing their rice as bittern friendly rice. So that's there's sort of cool opportunities, I guess, in agriculture across the board. This is one in growing wood fibre and wood products. This organisation actually takes degraded farmland and tries to create biodiverse forests on those degraded farmlands to produce both firewood, high quality timber products, but actually also provide habitat and sequester carbon. I'm just giving you, I guess, a bit of a snapshot of some of the cool opportunities and things that are happening in business. I know, I'm sure many of you are already in the impact investment game, but this is just a nice example, I guess, of a water fund that's buying water at particular times and then using it to, and then selling it off and using at the right time and using it for environmental flows to help conserve threatened species and restore freshwater wetlands through the Murray-Darling Basin. This is people like the Nature Conservancy and Kilter Rural have been involved in these kind of pretty innovative economic instruments. Around 50% of Australia's land mass is under the jurisdiction of traditional owners and has native title over it. So working with and supporting traditional owner groups through ranger programs and in Indigenous protected areas is a hugely important activity. We do quite a lot of work with traditional owners in helping to restore traditional land management and cultural fire for cultural continuity and also to provide good outcomes for biodiversity. So there's some really cool projects going on in that space as well. This is one really close to my heart. We know that kids are very amenable to nature and nature is a big part of their lives, but as they get into the teen years, they can start to lose that connection with nature. We've seen some fantastic work in bringing ideas of culturally significant species or icon species into schools. This is just one example here in Melbourne where they oriented the grade 5 science curriculum around culturally significant species. They did plantings of endangered species, and they also had an Indigenous food garden and studied the students' interest in science, and it dramatically increased, particularly in girls, their engagement in science because of this connection that they were having into nature through their science curriculum. So there's some cool things happening in that space as well that I think show a lot of support, a lot of opportunity to roll out. Finally, I guess, oh, sorry, Stephen.
I was just going to say, I'm just keen to sort of have Thea chat a bit and then have questions for both of you.
Of course, yeah.
Are you okay to sort of, yeah, that'd be great. And then we'll bring Thea in and then we'll have questions for both of you if that's
fantastic. Okay. Yeah, perfect. Right. Okay, this is my last slide. So yeah, it's really critical that we have this support for organisations that are at the front line. Obviously, I have a particular vested interest in the Biodiversity Council, but there's other fantastic organisations like Bush Heritage and Australian Wildlife Conservancy that you can support who are doing critical work on the ground. So yes, I'll leave it at that. It's a bit of a grim summary, I'm sorry to start with, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to all create positive change. All right.
Thank you so much. That was just a chock-a-block full of amazing, really interesting education for us, I suppose. What we thought we'd do is there are a couple of Brendan's answered already some of the questions in the chat. I know there's some more, but we'd like to bring Thea in now, and then what we might do is at the end have questions for Thea and for Brendan. So Thea is the founder and now the chair of the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change. It's a grassroots organisation that Thea started that mobilises people of all faiths to take effective action for climate justice. It's been growing in numbers and doing fantastic work for many years, and Thea's going to tell us a little bit more about it. So over to you.
Hey, thanks for having me, Carolyn. And Stephen. Yeah, I'm here on Bidjigal country of the Darug Nation. And ARC, as we call it, started in 2007. It was started by the Climate Institute. So we're going on to a whole different topic, different from biodiversity, but connected. And I also very much care about biodiversity. So I really enjoyed your talk. Thanks, Brendan. I'm a retired social worker. Most of my life I've spent on social justice. When I've been in my own time as a volunteer, I've been an advocate mostly on anti-poverty issues, but switched over to climate as a central focus about 15 years ago, as I co-founded ARC. Our mission is to organise people of faith to act on climate change. And we found from a very early time that the leaders of and the people of various religious traditions were quickly on the same page when it came to the kind of policy actions we wanted to see. There's a lot of disagreements and clashes between people of different traditions, but on the topic of environment and climate change, there was a lot of synergy. And over the years, we've published open letters, and each of those open letters has become more and more sort of radical and more hard-hitting, and we just keep getting sign-on. Until last year, we had, quite a strong statement from the very highest faith leaders in Australia and the Pacific, urging the Australian government to stop opening up new coal and gas mines, urging the government to stop putting public money into supporting coal and gas projects, and asking for much more radical climate finance. So we've been quite successful in many ways on very small amount of money. For 7 years, we didn't have any money at all, or just the minimum, public liability insurance. We weren't employing anybody. We've started employing people since 2017, but just basically a 1 or 1.5 full-time equivalent. And all of that, all the rest is volunteers working together. Our high points have been a convergence of faith leaders, basically priests, bishops, nuns, rabbis, people from different traditions, on Canberra, where we met each time with, say, 30 members of parliament and ministers. This is all since 2010. We held basically a fossil fuel divestment campaign for about 3-4 years, and our member organisations and supporters were the ones that basically drove the divestment of the fossil fuel divestment of 20-30 religious organisations in Australia, reminding people here that faith organisations are the largest single type of organisation divesting from fossil fuels worldwide. We've participated in quite a few campaigns alongside people from the climate movement, which have involved a certain level of civil disobedience, but very carefully, I guess, thought through strategically, and not in large numbers. Last year, we got involved in the People's Blockade at Newcastle. We try to amplify the work of the rest of the climate movement and give it a kind of faith message and a faith blessing. And we've tried to be a kind of a bridge between the climate movement and the faith sector, which moves usually at a much slower pace than the rest of the climate movement does, and are more cautious, of course, about what they do and what they say in general. But we hope that we've been providing some kind of leadership and assisting them to move faster than they might have. We're part of Green Faith International, which is an international multi-faith organisation. We've held 2 Faiths for Climate Justice actions where we're basically pushing a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty and for the world to move away from fossil fuels. And we've got another one coming up in the week of the 3rd to the 12th of May, I'll just start showing you some slides because there's nothing quite like seeing the work we do in pictures, so that you get a bit of a visual of the kind of work we do. So that's the kind of action we can take is prayer vigils. This one was a dawn service on World Environment Day last year. And at the same time, we co-signed a letter to the coal industry leaders in Newcastle, asking them to stop exporting coal through the Newcastle port for one day at least. That's the kind of symbolic action we might take. Or we've had funerals for coal. We've had various prayer vigils. Sorry, yeah. Now I'm just trying to think how we move that one along. Excuse me while I figure out how to move it along. Yeah, that's right. So prayer vigil in front of Parliament House. This one was Buddhist-led. Just to give you a picture of what we do, we're able to get material into faith-based media, which is something that the rest of the climate movement is less easily able to do. This was during a Faiths for Climate Justice action. Again, we've had major events inside cathedrals, in a way showing that institutional religion supports strong action on climate change. We try and harness everything we can, local congregations, leaders. We have connections with Aboriginal leaders and people who join in our symbolic actions too. We have these, you're seeing some of the banners here that we use, and we've got hundreds of banners across Australia on churches and temples and places of worship. We have a lot of local groups, so local communities and in cities, and we have groups that join our various actions. So we're very decentralized, and then attract local media for these kinds of actions, trying to sort of encourage people across society, and particularly people of faith, to connect climate action with their beliefs. Here's one of our sit-ins last year, which was associated with a win. Again, well, we managed, along with a lot of other organisations, to persuade NAB and the other major four banks, the other of the major four banks, and some Japanese banks, to stop funding Whitehaven Coal, along with Market Forces and a few other organisations. But we were part of that campaign, which was quite successful. And we had a number of sit-ins in Hobart, Melbourne, Sydney, to put pressure on NAB. Now, just getting to our plans for the next few months, until the election, we'll be asking people to put pressure on their local member by visiting them, by writing to them. We've already organised a couple of visits to Canberra of ministers. We've visited Chris Bowen and Pat Conroy and Tanya Plibersek, encouraging them to take much stronger action on climate change, with some very senior faith leaders. The Archbishop of Brisbane was one of them. In the lead up to the election, we'll be doing work in various electorates along with our partners in the climate movement to have more pro-climate candidates in each of the electorates when putting our weight behind them. So we sometimes have actions outside and attract local media. And this is another local group. This one's in Kiama. We also are going to continue because we've had a little work on divestment, fossil fuel divestment happening all this time since 2013, encouraging individuals, people. So this one was a push on Catholic dioceses to divest from fossil fuels. We're also going to continue our work diversifying the climate movement through outreach to minority faith traditions. And we'll join Rising Tide again this year in their work. A few of our people were arrested at the People's Blockade. And this is my last slide to show our boat at the People's Blockade in Newcastle. This one is during the police sanctioned part of the blockade. We had this boat, we had it running around a number of times along with all the kayaks. It's kind of symbolic of us, though, us being the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change and ARC being the acronym. I thought it was a really a nice little play, that one. Brendan, who skippered that boat, would never join something that wasn't police sanctioned, but that's another story. Okay, that's just a bit about us.
Great. Thank you so much, Thea, and congratulations on everything you're doing and achieving. It's absolutely fabulous. And I think it complements what Brendan was talking about very nicely in terms of seeing the impact on the ground as well. So thank you both. I might just throw it over to questions. We've got another 10 or 15 minutes here for both of you. And I might just, so if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat for either Thea or Brendan. I might just sort of kick off. I mean, you've both been involved in biodiversity and the climate movement for a long time. I mean, looking forward, given, some of what you've both spoken about, and particularly yourself, Brendan, I mean, how do you stay optimistic? Because I know you're an optimistic person. So maybe over to you first on that one, Brendan.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, good question. I mean, we definitely have an incredible community of people who care deeply for nature and are committed to, I guess, the conservation of biodiversity and just keep turning up. And it's something about nature and the natural world that is deeply inspiring. And we've actually found that it varies a bit across demographic groups, but generally the best and most consistent motivator for people to change consumption habits or do something slightly differently that's better for the environment is the awe and wonder of nature. So it's still a bit that kind of David Attenborough thing, but it's perhaps a little more focused on what you can actually do to help preserve this incredible natural heritage that we have. And so it is, I guess it's deeply inspiring. It's probably like what keeps primary school teachers going back to what I would consider a totally intolerable workplace every day. They're just inspired by kids and the interactions that they can have with kids. Well, for us, it's the same with biodiversity, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. And Thea, for you, what keeps you optimistic?
Oh, a few things, but like Brendan, it's the people that you're working with. People are so determined. They're so, positive and, committed to a cause much greater than themselves. And we're working with really good people all the time, inside and outside the faith traditions. I mean, the climate movement's full of just amazing people. And then the other side for me, I guess, is, as you can expect, my faith. And I just, know that ultimately there is a God, a creator who has a sort of just purpose for the world. So I think different ones of us from different faith traditions will draw hope and strength from each of our spiritual traditions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the chat as well, so I might go to the first one's from Evan, and it's for Brendan. I'd love to see more examples of businesses promoting biodiversity like Wood, which we thought looked amazing too. Where can we find more information about that sort of thing?
I'm sort of embarrassed to say that I get this question a lot, and yet I still haven't created the website that can point you to all of the different businesses that are doing amazing things. There are many. You know, I'm quite sure some of you would have come across a guy called Nigel Sharp. He's a property entrepreneur. He's invested a lot in trying to create good examples of where particularly agricultural development can be done in a way that benefits biodiversity. One of the stories I sometimes tell is about his property called Tiverton out in Western Central Victoria, where they actually have fenced off an area. They've got endangered eastern barred bandicoots in there that each turn over around 10 tons of soil per bandicoot each year. That creates incredible soil aeration, and they're grazing sheep on those native pastures, which sounds, you know, like an anathema to a conservationist, producing the best wool, getting the highest prices and conserving endangered mammal, critically endangered mammal at the same time. So there's a lot of really fantastic things that people are doing. The Biodiversity Council is there to try and amplify and tell the story about the good things that people and companies and businesses are doing. So more and more, I guess, we'll start accumulating stories on our Biodiversity Council website about who's doing great things for nature in the private sector and in businesses. There are a few other stories I could go on about, but I don't want to take up too much more time. In terms of optimism, I just popped in a link into the chat to a book that was written a little while ago called, we call the Book of Hope, but it's a book of stories of where species have actually been brought back from the brink of extinction. And it's a really wonderful compendium of good news stories, I guess, about biodiversity. Another way that we stay optimistic, because we know that we can, if we invest properly, we can actually turn things around. And I've been heartened by the way the climate movement has been able to turn public opinion around climate change. We just need to do that around habitats and biodiversity. I'm sure we can eventually.
Brendan, I was in New Zealand last week, and I went to Zealandia in Wellington, which you probably know about. It's a sort of a fenced area designed to bring back native bird species, and it's only 2 kilometres from the centre of Wellington City, and they've done a phenomenal job in 20 years of so many bird species all through Wellington. So
Yeah.
I think the Book of Hope is right.
Yeah, and there are a lot of places. If you ever get a chance to go to an Australian Wildlife Conservancy fenced reserve where they've actually fenced out all the cats and foxes, some of them are fairly big, you walk around at night and it's just different. The earth is softer because all of these small mammals are digging up. It just feels and is differently, and everything's the place is literally leaping with life at night, and it's an incredible experience. And it must be an experience from, you know, 200 or 300 years ago that we just don't get now when we walk around in our bush. Our bush is still amazing, but it is missing some pretty critical components of the ecosystem.
We've got more questions here. So which one should we go on there?
I was just going to ask, Donna Lee's asked about law, how Australian law looks good on paper, and how do we get the judiciary to see environmental and wildlife crime as serious? I was actually wondering if you would touch on the EPBC review, which is the federal government review, the review of the Federal Government Act.
Yeah,
it's meant to be protecting our biodiversity. Would you comment for a minute on that?
Yeah, look, we absolutely have to stop land clearing, simple as that, and land habitat degradation. We have to recognize that there is a lot of land out there that we can continue to do stuff on without trading away more and more habitats. I mean, we really are down to, for the Western Plains grasslands just west of Melbourne here, a little bit like the Cumberland Plain woodlands just west of Sydney, we're in the less than the last 1% that's left, and yet we're still slicing off the corners, taking away those small patches of habitat that are so critical to preventing extinctions and for keeping so many species in the game. So look, the number one thing is we've got to push the government for strong laws that actually properly protect these last of the last habitats and don't keep trading them away. So it's not easy. Like, we thought we were in with a pretty good show with this government in terms of this law reform process. We've set out very clearly what it's got to contain. I'm not totally convinced we're going to win that argument, at least in the first round of Parliament. There is still a lot of vested interests in there wanting to free up land clearing, wanting to free up, they call it cutting green tape. I mean, it's absurd. 97% of all submissions that are put to the EPBC Act for permission to clear habitats are approved. Like, this idea that there's this immense kind of mire of green tape that's stopping projects is a total myth. And, you know, there are plenty of documents out there that make it very clear, including Graham Samuel's review of the EPBC Act that was published a couple of years ago, that this is sort of the precursor to the EPBC Act reform process. There are just some very effective vested interests who seem to be able to convince both sides of politics that any kind of green regulation is going to stop us from doing what we need to do in terms of business and livelihoods. I think it's actually just rubbish, but we need to resolve that myth. That's why the Biodiversity Council is there alongside a whole bunch of other organisations to just keep telling this story to the public. I guess it's the Climate Council used to basically couch themselves as just cutting through the bullshit, and that's what they've done that well around climate. We need to do that same thing around nature and biodiversity.
Yeah, we had Amanda McKenzie from the Climate Council chat to us last year, and she was saying, yeah, she was saying, yeah, exactly, very similar to what you're saying. Thea, one more for you, just more broadly. When you think about what you've learned and how your group's had an impact, you know, we've got a lot of people on this in our group who want to have an impact. Are there any 1 or 2 tips that you would give to us in terms of what we can all individually do to have that impact?
Individually, what can people individually do
Mm.
to have an impact on climate change? Yeah,
or within our group, yeah.
Oh, if I had to pick one, it would be to use your super for impact investing and stop investing in fossil fuels. That'd be my sort of, as an individual action, that's probably the single most effective thing that people can do. Is that the kind of question? Is that answering the question?
Yeah, I just wondered, you know, lots of people in our group want to do things, and if there was anything you've learned, you know, from being within ARC and what you've achieved.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we talk a lot about lifestyle changes, and then the divestment conversation was completely separate. We've actually put the two together and compared the impact of, say, eating less meat, you know, versus, and, you know, say, not flying overseas versus divestment. And fossil fuel divestment is, you know, especially with your life savings, which is what your super is, you know, really performs all the other things that you can do, I think.
Yeah, I'd really support that as well. I think that we need to be much more rigorous with the way we let investment firms invest our money. It's a lot of the companies that even come under the green portfolios don't look very green for me. So yeah, so there's a lot of really important scrutiny that needs to be applied there, I think. And just to support Thea's point, personal choices are really important. Like, we encourage people to think about looking for certified products in the supermarkets and avoiding certain types of products. But actually, the biggest things you can do are political. If you can actually convince the government to get rid of ludicrous loopholes in land clearing laws and that sort of thing, that is huge. So, you know, putting your energy behind organisations that are trying to essentially lobby for better political and policy outcomes is still the #1 thing that you can do in this country. I think it can be a bit awkward sometimes, that's all.
Thank you so much. Tonight has just been the most amazing, interesting and stimulating and heartening discussion. It's been terrific to hear from you both, Brendan and Thea. Thank you so much for everything you do, and also for sharing your amazing experiences. We really appreciate it. Just before we wind up, I'm going to let everybody know the next few months' speakers that we have. We've got a terrific lineup. In April, we're planning a session on holding power to account through the law, and it'll our guest is Isabel Reinecker, who's the founder of the Grata Fund. They're currently funding over 20 legal cases, including cases for Indigenous water and land rights. In May, we have a session on bushfire. We're having Serena Joyner, who's the CEO of Bushfire Survivors for Climate Action. And we're also having Greg Mullins to speak to us about bushfires. In June, we're having a session on the intersection of future architectural planning and the environment. So it ties in with something that Brendan touched on. Thomas Rivard, who is an architect and a futurist, and we're also hoping to have someone from Nightingale Housing. So we're really excited about the next few months. Keep spreading the word about the group and inviting other people, because everybody's welcome. And we look forward to seeing you in April.
Thanks again, Brendan.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.